You're right. There's a lot of sort of Indian influence in the music. And so back to sort of like my story, when my parents came here in the late 70s, I was born soon after they got here. Yes, and at that time, they brought like $8 with them to the U.S.
Are you serious?
That's all they had coming to this country. There was no foreign currency reserve at the time. It's pre-Reagan, whole other thing, but no foreign currency reserve. And so there was only like a finite amount of rupees you could exchange for dollars before coming to the U.S.
Wow.
So they came here with $8 on scholarships. I was born. They sent me back to India to be raised by my grandparents for the first few years of my life.
Oh, wow.
2, 3 years. And so I grew up listening to like old Hindi music that like my grandparents would play for me. And so that's all I listened to. And then my mom would send, and this will move into this other thing later, but my mom would send cassette tapes with her voice on it to me in India for me to hear her voice, for her to sing me lullabies, tell me she loved me, she missed me, all that, right? Yeah. Because it was $24 a minute to make a long distance phone call.
$24 a minute.
That's what it was. And if you talked, it'd be like, hello, 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 hello. You'd hear like an echo go on forever. Yeah. They're the worst phone calls. So I had my mom singing me Nanhi kali sone chali hawa dire aana. These old little lullabies, old Hindi lullabies on these cassette tapes. And I would hear all this stuff. And so my musical DNA was sort of being formulated at that time between old Hindi music and people, and my parents who are now in the West, I'm in the East, reversed, sending sending their music to me and me learning that way. So in my blood is this, it's there, that Indian music.
Mm-hmm. You start playing in India? You start playing when you get back to the States?
When I got back to the States, I started singing when I got back to the States more.
First, okay.
But as a kid, I was exposed to all this music. And in my band, there's hints of the sort of Indian influence in the music. Because then I grew up in the U.S., and then I loved R.E.M. and the Beatles and the Police and the Cure and the Smiths and Depeche Mode and and then I also had this love for Indian music, and I grew up singing Indian music. My mom would be like, every Sunday we'd go to temple, and on the night before she would write these lyrics out, and she's like, you're going to sing this song in front of 100 aunties and uncles in temple tomorrow. And as a nervous wreck, I would go and sing in front of all these aunties and uncles every Sunday from age 7. So I was an Indian singer and singing Indian music, and then I also loved all this other Western music. So all that stuff became part of the way I wrote music with my band, somewhere in between, somewhere between. And in my scores, it never entered my scores, ever.
Okay.
It was always like, I kept it very separate. I didn't want to be like known to be like, just because I'm Indian, that's all I know.
Right.
So I never did that. But then on this show, the first episode was not very Indian. Second episode wasn't very Indian. But it was episode 13. Season 1, episode 13. The one that you guys just aired.
We were just talking about the
three sentences.
Yeah, 3 sentences.
Okay. Yeah.
In that episode, our editor sent me the sequence of Jack's funeral. And it starts off with Chrissy on the sticks in that weight loss camp.
Yes.
And she's going, just banging those sticks. And all of a sudden you cut to this minute and 45 second sequence back and forth of her playing the sticks. Her as a kid, she's looking at the size of her sweater.
Yeah.
You see Jack doing like Vogue stuff with her.
Yep.
That's right.
You cut back to Chrissy on the sticks.
Yep.
And then as that scene is getting more and more sort of like involved, like what's happening, all of a sudden out of nowhere, we flash to Jack's funeral.
Right.
And what I'm getting also has no sound. It's just silent, not even dialogue, except for, the Vogue stuff.
Sure.
So we cut to the funeral and it's just nothing, just like that. And all of a sudden you see the teens at the funeral. You see Jack's picture. You see the urn.
Yeah.
You're in this silence for like the next minute and you're like, holy shit, this is what I just saw. This is like, it's haunting. It's the most haunting scene
I'm getting
to
goosebumps
date
as
of
you're
the
talking
show.
about it. Yeah.
And then it comes back to Chrissy just screaming her head off.
Yes.
Yeah, that guttural scream.
That guttural scream, which was just so beautiful. And her performance was unreal in that.
Yeah.
And Koch calls me and he says, I think, Sid, you can do something with Chrissy's beat, her
the
percussion
rhythmic, like,
of those sticks
Yeah.
that she's hitting in that weight loss camp. Let that be a guide for you in some way. Maybe work off that. Maybe find a way to use the rhythms in it or figure something out. And in that moment, I picked up my guitar, I watched the scene, and I started playing. Sterling's our engineer right here. I love it.
I got you.
You like that positioning? Are you good? Is that good?
Yeah, that seems right.
Yeah, good. Seems like you approve.
let's do it.
And I'm watching the picture, and I start playing this loop of. And I start singing. And this is basically like that whole thing is a drone.
Okay, so real quick. So
I mean,
I'm not
Sid, I'm
crying.
Let him go. Let him go.
I'm not changing. I'm not. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you keep going.
I'm not
You keep
changing chords. Like in Indian music, stuff sits on the tonic, which is sort of like starting point.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it's what you return to in music.
Okay.
You don't hear like Indian music. You don't hear big changes in the music. You just hear like loops of like a drone.
Right.
So in my mind, okay, this is like an Indian drone. And I started singing, ah-dum, da-dum. And then there's a change I made in the melody, which is the most Indian thing you could do. It's like deep and classical. So, it's that. And then as I'm just jamming to this funeral, I like in my studio, you didn't hear it on the final recording as much, but I was like, this is so Indian, so Desi. So I was like, ah, na, 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 na. I started doing stuff like that, like riffing. And I was like, why am I going into this Indian place all of a sudden out of nowhere? And so then the final melody, I started pulling some of the Indian stuff out because this is an NBC show. And I'm like, this is going to feel too weird on TV. No. So I went, oh, 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 oh. It became the theme.
Yeah.
And I saved that high sort of part for the moment we see the funeral.
Yeah.
That's
Until then, it's just she's on the sticks.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, Koch told me, find a way to get the rhythm of the sticks into it. And I'm like, this is just sticks hitting a wooden floor.
Yeah.
I have a wooden table I'm recording on. And I start going. It almost became like tablas. Indian tablas go doom, 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 doom. Like that's how a tabla player plays. And I did that. So that became this pulse underneath as if I was a tabla player, but playing it on my wooden table.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want it to get too Indian. I was like, we're not going to use tablas, we're going to use the table.
Yeah.
And I recorded this thing. I remember that moment. It was like, there's times where you feel like you write something. There's times I've done this with, and I'm sure, Taylor, you have felt that way, and with your own music, you guys are like, is that when you write something that you think that in your heart is special, like you want to listen to it over and over again sometimes.
Yeah.
There's like the ego kicks in a little bit. And I remember when I wrote this, I was just like, this is different. I feel really, really good about this. And I sent it to Dan, to the picture, and to our editor. And I was like, what do you think of this? And Dan was like, he wrote back and he goes, that was, what did he say? He goes, that was transcendental or something. Oh, yeah. And he writes something like that to me. And he goes, he was like, you just knocked it out of the park. That's it. And I was like, I remember asking, I was like, is this too Indian?
Yeah.
And he goes, no, it's perfect. And I was like, even though I know this is on NBC playing, you know, like it's like we're not as, like, this is like, do I have the liberty to explore like this and go there? And Dan's like, don't touch a thing. He goes, and he, I remember him saying, he goes, what you did in this episode, from that point on, it changed the sound of the show.